agroecological practices question transforming the dominant agro-food system. Initiatives for agroecology and food sovereignty have been converging. The global network, La Via Campesina, advocates, quote, transforming the food system based on the principles of agroecology, agrarian reform, and food sovereignty. In the past decade, European civil society and farmers' movements have increasingly discussed the prospects for agroecology as an alternative to the dominant agro-food regime. They have been intervening in political debates on future agriculture, building support for agroecological experiments, and demanding policy changes favorable to agroecology. These initiatives were inspired by high-profile initiatives in the Global South. Agroecology has been promoted as an innovative practice, enhancing farmers' knowledge, resource conservation, and societal benefits. And the concept innovation has been emphasized in order to intervene in and hopefully shift the EU policy discourse on innovation. Innovation in agroecology links organizational, social, know-how, and technological change all together. Since 2008, Technology Platform Organics has organized stakeholder consultations on how to prioritize research proposals to the European Commission. Many of these proposals have been funded. The diagram shows you the overview of the agenda from Technology Platform Organics, whose lead author was Urs Nigli. I mentioned him because he's here today and will give a talk at the 6 o'clock German language session right here today. At the top of that diagram, you see eco-functional intensification, which means intensifying ecological processes for agricultural production. This denotes on-farm nutrient recycling and biodiverse means to protect crops or livestock within a wider agro-ecosystem, itself a public good. As farmers add value through agroecological methods and quality products, short food supply chains are essential for helping them to gain more of the value that they have added relative to market intermediaries, which otherwise would capture more of the value and so lose income for the farmers. In particular, the participatory guarantee systems have been elaborated firstly in the Global South and more recently in Europe. These provide consumer citizen support for farmers' efforts at continuous improvement of production methods, by contrast with the strict criteria for organic certification. Another key part of the agenda is the empowerment of local economies linked with regional food chains will be an important trend in European agriculture and food production. As the previous speaker mentioned, official expert studies have highlighted farmers' knowledge and innovation which lacks official recognition and so isn't even seen as innovation. To remedy this gap or blind spot, the EU's Standing Committee on Agricultural Research set up a foresight expert group to do a series of studies. These have advocated wider knowledge networks for agricultural innovation, especially farmers' ecological experiments, in situ genetic diversity, that is by contrast with seed banks, and farmers' knowledge exchange. That's from the 2008 report. And then in the next report, they said the highest priority should be given to low input, that means low external input, but high input of farmers' knowledge and locally available resources for high output results, integrating historical knowledge and agroecological principles that use nature's capacity and models nature's systems. In effect, as in the concept eco-functional intensification. Now, these agroecological alternatives have the potential to challenge and even transform the dominant agro-food regime. So what is that regime? What must be transformed? According to the rural sociologist Harriet Friedman, in the dominant regime, agro-food corporations are the major agents attempting to regulate the conditions of production, consumption, and market exchange. And these corporations are given the so-called freedom to create and shape these markets by government policy. Their agri-industrial methods generate surpluses which are then exported, so undermine productive capacities and less intensive methods elsewhere, thus pushing farms everywhere to adopt intensification methods in order to compete on these globalized markets. Many alternatives have arisen, sometimes contesting the dominant regime, but sometimes being adapted to green that regime, such as functional foods or industrialized types of organic farming, towards what Harriet Friedman somewhat sarcastically calls a corporate environmental regime. That is, the corporate regime presenting itself as green. Now, some agroecological methods have been incorporated into the dominant agro-food regime. Some governments, especially France, have adopted agroecology programs, which have the benefits of opening up new opportunities for such methods, but also provoke suspicion about the agenda. Is it a way of greening the conventional system? In addition, the concept sustainable intensification includes agroecology in a broad toolkit, along with GM crops. So how should we understand these ambiguous roles of agroecology? So in particular, for the European context, how does agroecological innovation conform to the dominant regime, or else how to transform it? How do these divergent trajectories arise in the same context, perhaps in tension with each other? And what strategies can strengthen a transformative role for agroecology? First, we turn to a general theory of niche innovations. Agroecological practices have gained some protection from market competitive pressures through what are called more generally niches. That is, it can mean government support, can mean special types of protected markets. Within this protective space, niche actors can nurture the path-breaking innovations so that it becomes more robust through performance improvements. But this niche innovation can play various roles, depending on its empowerment strategy. A fit and conform empowerment makes the niche innovation competitive with mainstream socio-technical practices and otherwise unchanged selection environments. An innovation that is originally perceived as path-breaking becomes merely incremental in terms of its broader implications, such as organic agriculture being conventionalized. In stretch and transform empowerment, by contrast, innovations aim to undermine the incumbent or dominant regime. These niches, or more precisely, the niche actors, influence their selection environments, contingent on the specific empowerment strategies that they pursue. So, what are the empowerment strategies for agroecological practices, and in particular for a transformative role? If we go back to the earliest period, initially a focus on ecological science limited agroecology to a marginal role within the research and agricultural systems. But as a key paper by Wetzel pointed out, agroecology has three forms: a scientific discipline, an agricultural practice, and a social movement. So a transformative rule for agroecology depends on integrating its three forms in practice while recognizing their mutual dependence. And this mutual dependence is nicely illustrated by this three-part picture from Brazil. At the top, agricultural practices, then marches as a social movement, and mobile fairs promoting transdisciplinary knowledge. There's also an important statement by a Belgian group of agroecologists who say that a transformative role for agroecology depends on socioeconomic principles, in particular, to generate collective knowledge and adaptability through networks involving all these stakeholders, foster the possibilities for choosing autonomy from global markets, use diverse skills and knowledge in constructing both the issues and the publics concerned by these issues, as well as in seeking solutions. So that's the transform potential and means to achieve that potential. Let's look at the conform potential and practices. Organic farming has already been conventionalized in some places, say by imitating intensive agro-industrial methods. Some organic systems have increased their reliance on biological inputs in order to raise productivity for more price-competitive food, that is, to compete with agro-industrial food. Beyond the organic sector, biological inputs have been commoditized. There are companies selling these inputs, thus continuing farmers' dependence on input suppliers rather than enhancing their skills and knowledge for using local available resources. Some agro-industrial farmers and companies have appropriated some aspects of agroecological methods, even branding their own methods as agroecology. Here is McDonald's agroecology strategy. It's a French website, so le plan éco-progrès pour l'environnement. More generally relevant to this tension is the concept sustainable intensification, which was originally popularized by Jules Pretty 2 decades ago. This aimed to enhance the livelihoods of African smallholders using local available resources, but it was later adapted for a different agenda. After the 2007-2008 food crisis, there was a new policy aim among global institutions and governments for greater productivity. So they adopted and recast this concept, which I'll call SI from now on. This is distinguished from the original, we'll say, conventional intensification, in that it aims to minimize chemical inputs and pollution while also enhancing global market competitiveness of commodity crops, by contrast with the original concept from Jules Pretty. So SI has been welcomed for recognizing contributions from agroecological methods for minimizing or avoiding chemical inputs, but the concept is suspected of subordinating these methods to a different agenda, namely the dominant food regime. For example, according to the Syngenta Foundation, sustainable intensification includes no-till conservation agriculture, that is conserving the soil by using GM herbicide-tolerant crops and herbicide spreads. Let's look more generally at the meanings given to this concept, sustainable intensification. For the major EU agro-industry lobby, COPA, it means resource efficiency. Quote, to satisfy the demand for SI, it is essential to have better conditions for more efficient use of water, fertilizers, and other resources at farm level. So it's reduced to something trivial. For the Food and Agriculture Organization, it means the basis for a program, a sustainable crop production intensification. This aims at increasing agricultural productivity through improved use of resources to achieve higher yields while promoting the sustainability of the farming system. Well, that could mean an improvement for smallholders, except that it also aims to integrate them more effectively into global markets. And it's competing with the dominant regime. For the Royal Society, SI is, quote, knowledge, technology, and land intensive. Through measures including agroecology and GM crops. So in these ways, the sustainable intensification agendas promote a toolkit of options for somehow reconciling environmental sustainability with global market competition. This blurs the distinction between an agroecological agenda and a capital-intensive input market-driven agenda. And here, market means global market competition. Now let's look more specifically at the European context, where expert reports discuss a trade-off between productivity versus biodiversity as a basis to seek agroecological methods which can minimize such trade-offs or even offer synergies among them. In practice, productivity is often equated with the yield of commodity crops, in turn attributed to specific techniques. Thus, this focus on productivity in that narrow sense means the trade-off remains difficult or impossible. I mean, to overcome. By contrast, productivity can mean the entire useful biological output, for example, through intercropping, where the crops benefit each other, as well as the ecosystem services from agroecological methods. This agroecosystem approach valorizes wider public goods, partly to enhance the agroecological methods themselves. So this could help overcome the usual trade-off because it enhances productivity in that broad sense and biodiversity at the same time. But this approach remains marginal to the agendas for sustainable intensification in practice. I'll skip this because we're running out of time. Now, I want to turn to the Common Agricultural Policy because efforts at greening the CAP have tensions analogous to sustainable intensification. And this illustrates why the concept really matters, even where it may be just implicit. Though, as many people here will know, from 2011 onwards, or even earlier, going back to the previous CAP, networks of civil society organizations and farmers proposed incentives for putting agroecological innovation at the heart of farming decisions. And that means policy frameworks and individual farmers. There was a positive response from DG Agriculture in the European Commission, which proposed measures for greening the criteria. But these were weakened or were relegated to mere options through heavy lobbying by the agro-industry lobby on the European Parliament. So let's look at the outcome. In the first pillar, which is the major part of the budget, otherwise known as single farm payments, farmers can be remunerated for 3 obligatory practices: maintenance of permanent grassland, ecological focus areas, and crop diversification. 5% of all large farms must be covered by these ecological focus areas, which are meant to bring environmental benefits, improve biodiversity, and maintain attractive landscapes through various measures, which you can read. Yet, so some member states in effect, have favored, quote, productive options, such as nitrogen-fixing crops, which facilitate intensive cultivation methods, increase production, but undermine biodiversity. Some of them simply use these methods as a supplement to chemical inputs. So here you see the trade-offs in action, and in response to this disappointing result of the greening, NGOs have asked their supporters to lobby their national and regional organizations, governments, for criteria favoring agroecological practices, especially biodiversity. I'm running out of time here, so a transformative role for agroecology depends on changes in policy frameworks in several policy areas: CAP, rural development measures, local territorial development strategies, agrarian reform for more equitable access to fertile land, farmers' rights to resow safe seeds, short food supply chains, research and innovation agenda setting through farmer-citizen participation, and new partnerships for multi-actor knowledge exchange, as well as structures for remunerating practitioners and researchers in such collaborative efforts by changing the reward structures of the research system. I have run out of time, but just one more. So, different potential roles for agroecological innovation. As mentioned before, agroecology has 3 practical forms. Their integration has provided a collective action mode for contesting the dominant agro-food regime and creating alternatives. Driven by CSO farmer alliances, European policy changes have been opening up more opportunities for agroecological practices. These can contest and transform the dominant regime, or they can conform to the dominant regime, or undergo tensions between those different roles, dependent on the specific empowerment strategies that they pursue. The concept eco-function intensification, based on agroecosystems, contrasts with the dominant policy framework of sustainable intensification, which is illustrated by the bias towards productive options in the so-called greening of the CAP. By recognizing these tensions between transform versus conform, agroecology networks can better develop intervention strategies for transformative aims. So I conclude with these questions. How to identify those tensions in practice, in specific contexts, and how to build more effective alliances and interventions for a transformative agroecology. Conclude there. Thank you.